Hello everyone, this is Dominika and welcome to our Expat Career and Lifestyle podcast. And today I have with me another fantastic guest, Kelsey Hoff. She's from Canada and she's living in Amman, Jordan. She's running her private counseling practice online and also face to face, and she's supporting expats and travelers with their mental health issues and well-being while living and traveling the world. So welcome, Kelsey. Thank you for being with us today. I am so excited to have you. So please tell us more about you and
Thank you so much for having me.
And what are you doing? Tell us more.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This is a really big honor to be interviewed by you. So I live in Amman, Jordan, and my abroad lifestyle actually started when I studied abroad for my undergrad in 2011. I studied in Israel, Palestine. For that. And I've had a long-term interest in the Middle East, and that study abroad definitely opened my eyes to all of the things that I could learn and the life experiences that I could gain through living abroad. So I graduated, and then I ended up actually moving back to Jordan after my undergrad, and I lived here for a year and a half, and I studied Arabic language, and I also volunteered in various capacities. And then I returned to Canada, got married, and I kind of wondered why I had spent so much time overseas. Not that I regretted it, but it's just I wasn't sure what that was for. I still had this interest, but then interestingly, many Syrian families were sent to my city, and I was one of several people in the small, fairly conservative city, not very multicultural, who had kind of an understanding of the Middle East perspective, and I also spoke the same form of Arabic that the Syrians spoke who were coming to my town. So that really sparked again for my husband and I an interest in the region. So we actually returned 2 years ago to Amman in order to study Arabic, and I've ended up starting or joining a private practice, but also starting an online component to a private practice to provide therapy to expats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very exciting.
So yeah, that's where we're at now.
Yeah. So now, are you speaking fluent Arabic, or are you still
no, I'm far from fluent. Arabic is a huge language. Yeah. I can get around fairly fine. I have Arabic friends who only speak Arabic too, but I'm far from fluent. And I don't do therapy in Arabic, only in English.
Yes, so because when we are moving like to different countries, different cultures, we can experience this so-called cultural shock. So I don't know if this was your experience, like moving from Canada to Jordan. So how, if you can give us like some tips or your own advice about how to avoid this cultural shock, or how to prepare yourself for the move and thrive in a new country.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, well, I'm not sure if there's actually a way to fully avoid cultural shock, because when you move to a new country, everything that you know is so different. And I think that cultural shock is your body's way of actually dealing with that jolt that happens when you go cross culturally. So I think that there are ways to manage it once it happens and also prepare for it. But I don't know if there's actually a way to not have it happen, except for maybe if you live in a bubble and not really go outside anything. But if you really want to fully experience everything that a culture has for you and the richness that living cross-culturally can be, I think that cultural shock would be a very normal experience and maybe even very, very expected. So as far as some tips, I think that preparation starts before you arrive. So learn as much as you can about a country before you arrive there. So what are things like there? Like, what are the major religions? How do people function in that culture? Maybe even reading some biographies of someone in that culture can give you a not just the facts, but maybe also empathy towards some of the dynamics in the culture. So yeah, learning about the culture is really important. Also, if you've traveled previously, that is a great benchmark to understand some of your dynamics as a traveler, right?
Mm-hmm.
So thinking back to those times that maybe you did something out of your comfort zone, and what did that feel like, and what did you learn about yourself, and what are things that maybe you could apply to a new experience. So that would be before you go. Oh yeah, another thing that bringing parts of home with you to your new culture can also be very helpful. So that might be things like, you know, a special mug or a special blanket or some pictures from home. So you're not trying to just transport your culture to your new culture, but also recognize you still come from a culture and your culture is important, and your culture does actually feel like home to you. So recognizing those dynamics ahead of time can actually set you up to manage those challenges once they come. When you arrive, I think it's really important to put yourself in the place of the learner. So sometimes we go into a culture and we use our own culture as the benchmark of what we deem as normal. But in reality, both are normal to the people who live there initially, right? So really putting yourself in a place where you ask good questions and observe a lot and listen a lot can actually set you up to not respond to the culture in a my culture versus this culture way, but more of an empathetic way of, wow, this is a lens that other humans have that maybe I don't have the same lens, but I can actually benefit from this lens. And so I think that also helps when the culture shock does occur, because it places you in a place of empathy instead of againstness, I guess. Yeah, I think that's what I have for now for that question.
Yeah, and so we can apply, I think, like the same when it comes like how to deal with the cultural differences when we want or we are working in a country, in a new country, we are moving abroad for work, or we want to run our business. Like, for example, you are running your
right.
Yeah. So how to deal with those cultural differences?
Right. Yeah. It's true that sometimes when those cultural differences happen, that's actually a time that culture shock can make an appearance, because you're trying to do something or you're trying to start something, but then the culture seems to be against you or something, or you can't. Maybe you did something in your own country and it works so well, but now you're trying to do the same thing here and it just doesn't work. And so one thing that I try to do is resisting being offended. Sometimes the first response is, how dare you not respond to this, or how dare this not work here, as if it's a personal jab, but it actually isn't personal. Those cultural dynamics existed long before you arrived. And also giving people the benefit of the doubt that whatever that dynamic was, very likely wasn't intended to be something against you. So giving people the benefit of the doubt that maybe that harsh interaction wasn't intended to be harsh. Or I'm sure all of us expats can think about interactions where we could have thought really poorly of the other person, but then coming to realize that they were actually seeing things from their culture, and it wasn't intended to be the way that we received it from our culture. And also, I think it's really important to do a lot of research into what sociologists have studied about cultures. There's so much information out there about what are the dynamics within given areas of the world. And there are words and frameworks to explain the different dynamics. So when we're given language to understand that, it gives us a perspective to describe what's going on. So gaining that perspective is really important.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree with you, like accepting that people like from different countries or different cultures, they can see us or what we are doing from their own perspective. It's not taking it like personally, as you said before. Yeah, so what was your biggest challenge when it comes to your international life and running your practice abroad, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah. So as in like what
was your own personal, your own like personal challenge? Because you moved from Canada to Amman, to Jordan. So it's I think it's like a different culture. It's a different culture. So what was your biggest challenge?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of my biggest challenges was, are you familiar with the concept of a low context culture and a high context culture?
Yes, I am familiar, but if you can explain more, like for our listeners, so if you can give us like an example, yeah.
Yeah, so Canada is a very low context culture. It's okay. There's kind of that view of you be you, I be me, and whatever, and so in Canada there's this sense of there isn't a correct way to do things, and there's a lot of flexibility around the proper way. And then coming to Jordan, which is actually a high context culture, there's a lot less flexibility around how things are done. So that comes out in religion being very much more prevalent than in my own culture. Gender roles. There are proper things for men to do and proper things for women to do. That comes out in the work relationship. It's much more hierarchical, or it really matters what your status is or your role in the workplace, and the way that you present yourself is very, very important. So that was really challenging for me, because I'm very much a just come as you are kind of person, and coming to from a low context culture to a high context culture, I've had to learn what are those things that I need to adapt to and actually change in order to be received well in this culture. And given I'm quite independent, I'm quite stubborn, that's been challenging for me to accept sometimes. But when I have accepted it, it's really neat, the relationships that I can build and the cultural perspective that I gain through that. So when I accept that, I'm suddenly invited into people's homes that I wouldn't be invited into otherwise, or maybe I gain a different perspective because people will share their stories with me because they recognize that I respect their culture. So that's really important to me, but it's not always easy, and it's not always fun.
Yeah, I think like respecting each other, and also like learning about different cultures, this can help us, and exploring yourself, also learning about you, how you are reacting, and what you can change, how you can adapt. This can This can help. So like, what do you see based on your own experience and also like working with the expat community? What do you see are like the biggest mistakes that expats or travelers are making when it comes to intercultural awareness and also the communication?
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that anyone who gets on an airplane and goes to a second culture and lives there is doing great, because many people would never do that. And so just the fact that someone does is something that I admire. But when in my interactions with expats, sometimes I see how many people get stuck in that rut of using their own culture as a template for what is right or correct. And like I mentioned earlier, that can really set you up for just feeling a lot of negativity all the time. Because if everything is compared to your own culture, then nothing's going to measure up, because it's just a whole different thing. So that would be one thing. I really think that it's important to invest in learning the language. That even to a small extent, ideally learn lots, because your whole world will open up. Even if you can get by using English, like there are certain parts of Amman where you could get by without speaking any Arabic, but I think that's very limiting. It doesn't actually connect you to the standard individual in the country. It only limits you to the demographic who speaks English. So that would be, in my context, that would be more people who maybe have traveled outside of Jordan, or have gone to the more internationally minded schools. So with that, if you don't speak Arabic, you don't really get the perspective of the majority, right? You're only getting the top couple percent.
Yeah.
If you limit yourself to that area. So I think speaking the language is so important. Also, in understanding the values of a country, a language is actually the mouthpiece of the culture. So without speaking the language, I think you miss out on certain perspectives that are really valuable in the culture.
Yeah, so learning the language, it's very important when you are moving abroad to any country. I think it's very important. Even here in Italy, learning Italian it's important. Moving to Poland, Polish is important. So so like how those cultural differences can impact our well-being, like on the mental and emotional level, when we are, for example, working, living, or running our businesses abroad.
Yeah, well, so many ways, because it invades everything. It's not just when you go to work, it's a cultural experience, but it's also a cultural experience when you go to the grocery store, or you ride in a taxi. Everything, right? Everything is different, and that difference starts to add up. That after a while, you say, why can't I just go buy bread and not have to stumble through ordering it, or not have to be stared at by people outside, or go wearing whatever I want. And so I think that those everyday pressures, we don't really identify them as going to get bread is the reason why I cracked, but it's everything combined, right? It's not really about the bread, but it's your entire life. Everything is so different, and everything also requires so much energy. So especially if you're speaking a second language alongside that, it's just you're not able to do what you used to do. So you might actually start feeling like you're not a productive person, because you have these expectations of yourself that you can accomplish this much in a day or this much in a month or a year, whatever. But then you realize that, wow, in this context, I really can't. And some people actually take that very personally, or take that to mean that they aren't really cut out for living abroad, or somehow they're deficient or defective. In the workplace, it can be really, really isolating, both physically and emotionally, because there's, especially if you're one of the only people from your culture or from a Western culture in an Eastern workplace, that that you don't quite understand what the dynamics are in the workplace. You just know that they feel different, and you just know that things just don't go in the same way that you're used to. And so that can also take a toll on your mental health. Also, sometimes, well, very often, issues that you dealt with in the past that you thought were old, things that you never will have to talk about or think about again, sometimes actually resurface when you're overseas. So I think everything combined, it puts you in a vulnerable state for having emotional or mental challenges while you're overseas. And also, a lot of people experience anxiety or depression or other mental health concerns for the first time while they're overseas. All of these things combined. So they go not thinking that they're likely to have any difficulties emotionally or mentally, but then they're quite surprised that, wow, they do experience anxiety intensely for the first time. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that living cross-culturally impacts the emotional and mental well-being of expats.
Yeah, and I think, like, as we mentioned, like at the beginning of this interview, like preparing yourself and learning about the culture and knowing that you are going to have challenges and that you are going to see like different habits or different values. So that this is somehow, it will be normal. So preparing yourself, preparation and learning the language. So this can help you, like, to avoid all those mental and emotional challenges, which are like part of our international life. So, but what about, because there's also like, let's say, a different type of cultural shock, right? Let's say when we are moving back to our home country. So we can see our home country now from a different perspective. And so it's like a so-called reverse cultural shock. And like our family, friends, or like colleagues, they like, for example, they can't understand why we are seeing everything from different perspectives. So what to do with that, like with the reverse cultural shock when moving back home?
Right.
Yeah,
great question. And sometimes it's the reverse cultural shock that surprises us so much.
Yeah.
Because maybe we expect to experience some culture shock when you're in a new country, but then coming home, you're like, oh, everything should be fine because I'm home now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But what you don't realize is that while you're away, you actually grew and changed and developed. And then when you return, it's almost like you're stepping into a new culture, because the culture that you used to know and feel so comfortable in, you don't fit into it in the same way that you used to. As well, you're isolated once again, because no one actually knows everything that you've experienced. They expect you to be just like you were before, but now you know that you're different. You have different perspectives. What you experience overseas has actually really impacted you in sometimes a lot of really, really good ways. But sometimes your home culture or community doesn't recognize it that way. And there's this sense of being off. You don't really know where you fit anymore. So I think it's really important that when you go home, it's really good to find at least one person who can empathize with you. So it might be someone who has done a lot of traveling or lived overseas themselves, that they can really like, okay, right, they understand what that means. It could also just be someone who is just really empathetic, who is just really open to understanding what is going on from you, and who you can really tell your stories to and express those challenging dynamics that are going on for you. Also, I think it's really important to be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Sometimes we kind of beat ourselves up, right? We say, oh, we should be able to jump from, different cultures and not have it affect us, or go home and not have it affect us. But in reality, we're all human, and these are all human things that are happening. And it's just your body and your emotions are working fine, and this is all just part of what happens when you jump between different cultures. So your mindset about yourself and who you are during this time is really, really important. Also, it's really important to recognize reverse culture shock for what it is. Well, I would say culture shock in general. Sometimes when we're experiencing culture shock, we don't actually recognize it as culture shock. We see it sometimes as incompetence, or saying, because I'm feeling this way in this culture, I'm not cut out for this life. Or if you go home and you experience reverse culture shock, sometimes you don't realize it as reverse culture shock, and you just think that everyone's against you. Or and I know that I've had that before, where I go home and I have all of these tense conversations. I was like, and I start to think, oh, everyone is, no one understands me, or something's wrong with me, or something's wrong with all of them. But when you recognize, okay, this is a reverse culture shock, then you can sit and say, okay, there's a name for this. I'm not crazy. There is a future, and everything will be okay. So I think that's really, really important. Also, don't make any really big decisions when you have just arrived in a country, or when you've just arrived home, because your sense of yourself and your future and what you want to do in your life is often not in the most steady place, and it's okay for it to be there. It's okay to feel that way for a period of time, but it might be best to identify it as culture shock, but also relieve yourself of any pressure to make big life decisions during that time.
Beautiful, beautiful. So thank you very much for sharing all those tips and also your experience. Please tell us, where can we find more information about you? And also, I know that you have a free gift for our listeners. So tell us more, Kelsey.
For sure. Yeah, I actually have an online therapy practice where I provide online therapy to expats all over the world. So I can be found at www.kelseyhoffcounselling.com. Well, I think that will be in the
I will put the link in the show notes.
Great. And also my email is there as well. And so that's where I can be found for all of the services that I offer, as well as I provide a free 30-minute consultation. So I really want you to feel good about seeking therapy or about seeking counseling, as well as in addition, I'll provide a 25% off your first session after the consultation.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you very much for sharing this fantastic gift with us and for being with us today. And to our listeners, please tell us, what are your learning points, insights, or what is your own experience when it comes to overcoming intercultural shock, or your mental and emotional challenges when moving and working abroad. Share in the comments, and I will be back soon with another fantastic guest. Thank you very much for listening or for watching. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you for being with us once again.